This is week 8, Evolution and Cognition, and thanks goodness it's the last one because I hate recording these solo sessions. It's about Buss's paper on evolutionary psychology and Balhus and Wynn's paper on evolution and explanation. So one of the themes is anthropomorphism, which is the tendency to see and interpret things in a human way, as if they were humans doing it and doing it in a human-like way, versus mind reading, which is also anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism is supposed to be a bad thing. It's supposed to be where you misinterpret things as being human-like and meaning the human thing when they don't in other animals, but or even in things. Whereas mind reading is supposed to be good. It's your capacity to go by the similarities between other people and yourself in interpreting what it is that the other people are feeling and meaning. Um, so how could these things be both, they sound like the same thing, how could they be both good and bad at the same time? I think the resolution is that obviously when you're interpreting other species, you don't want to make mistakes and project onto them stuff that's not really there. That's bad anthropomorphism. But on the other hand, you'd be foolish not to use your mind reading abilities. They work so well with other human beings. They work well with species that we've shaped and bred to be like us, like dogs and horses. We deliberately bred characteristics into them that are like ours or compatible with ours or understandable to us. Well, we also can, this also extends to our capacity to understand other species. And just as in Turing testing a robot, it would be silly to set aside this powerful mind reading capacity we have and not use it. In the same way, it makes little sense not to use this capacity when you're trying to understand other species and what they're doing and what they're meaning. To ignore it is to become a sort of a blind behaviorist and simply look at what they're doing and not make the slightest allusion to the fact that they're doing things that are rather similar to things that we can do, and maybe they mean the same things that they do in us. So it's a two-edged sword, anthropomorphism. It can overdo it, but it can also lead us to insights and understanding. The Bolhus paper makes a big point out of the difference between characteristics, genetic traits that are shared because of common descent, because we come from the same ancestor and because we're cousins, like the chimpanzees, versus traits that are shared just because the same outcome has come from a similar environment, but in unrelated species. You have this in the placental and the marsupial creatures in Australia, you have placental mammals, and in other parts of the world, you have marsupial creatures. They're not quite the same as regular mammals, but they tend to produce the same outcomes. There's a squirrel-like creature in each of these lineages. There's a mole-like creature, a rat-like creature. Um, so sometimes real similarities, are not because of common descent, but because evolution has converged on the same solution in the same environment by trial and error, by selective advantage. And this is a common outcome because, as I said, although I put it in a teleological way, it's not really teleological. I usually say that genes don't like to code rigidly things that they don't need to, more than they need to. They prefer to offload it onto predictable things in the environment. Well, of course, they don't have any preferences and they don't know anything. But what I mean is that the outcome of the blind process of selection, variation and selection, and depending on reproductive consequences, that process, the blind watchmaker, if you like, is one that tends to lead to coding less into the genome where possible, and rather allowing a predictable environment to set parameters or conditions rather than coding them into the genome rigidly. Because if they're coded rigidly into the genome, they have less flexibility. Well, many of these traits that evolve by a parallel evolution or convergent evolution are simply responses to the environment. The horseshoe crab and the horseshoe crab's eye and the mammal's eye both respond to the challenge of being able to transduce light, except that the horseshoe crab does it in a different way, with some shared principles. It doesn't have a retina, but it also has to do transduction of light in order to be able to perceive things optically. So some of the properties of light are enough to constrain the outcomes to come out to similar, even when the origins of the creatures, horseshoe crabs and ourselves and mammals, are very remote. Those are not obviously convergent evolution versus common descent are both evolution. So they're not arguments against evolutionary psychology. What you need to know about inclusive fitness is the usual slogan, I'll lay down my life for two brothers, four cousins, eight second cousins, and so on. Genes are the carriers of traits. It's genes that encode traits. They're crammed into organisms that are carrying them, if you like, and it's the survival and the reproduction of the organisms that calls the shots, but it's the genes that code them. And so, in general, for a gene that is coding for a trait, let's say there's two aspects of a gene. On the one hand, it's coding for a trait that is either advantageous or disadvantageous to its own propagation by appearing in a creature that survives. Obviously, if a genetic trait endangers the creature that has it, then it's already pricing itself out of the market. But the second thing it needs to do, besides helping a creature survive, is to help the creature reproduce and pass the trait on to the next generation. If a if a trait is favorable to survival and reproduction, it's not important for the gene whether it's in me or in my kids or in my cousins or in my parents. It's all in the family, if you like. So the fitness is not the fitness of the individual, but the inclusive fitness of all of the related creatures that have that same gene. What makes them related is that they share that same gene. With ants, the reason that ants help one another, and it's a big puzzle evolutionarily why any creature would waste any of its time and energy and resources and take the risk of helping another creature than itself, except if it benefits its own genes. That's why they're called selfish genes. And the reason that bees are so altruistic with one another is because they're all sisters. So you should consider the inclusive fitness of the entire beehive and all of the ones who share those same genes rather than individuals when you're considering what's adaptive and what increases fitness. A famous example of sex differences and adaptivity is the one of the peacock. Dawkins proposed the puzzle of signals of fitness. Females who are let me start from the beginning here. Males and females in sexually reproducing mammals, because in asexually reproducing creatures that split their whole bodies in order to reproduce, this doesn't apply. But in sexual reproduction, and in particular in mammalian sexual reproduction, there's a big asymmetry between the investment made by the male and by the female. In the case of fish, they lay eggs, and the male puts sperm on them, and then they both, in most cases, they both go away, and the fish sort of the eggs have to fend for themselves. But with mammals, the eggs stay inside the female, and a female mammal, especially a female human being, has only a small and finite number of potential successful offspring in a lifetime. So it makes a big difference to the female whether the insemination that she gets is from a fit male or an unfit male. If it's an unfit male, then one of her 7 or 8 chances at passing on her genes is lost. So females are very vigilant for fitness in males, and so males, of course, in order to be able to reproduce, are very anxious to display their fitness. And here's a peacock displaying his fitness with his huge tail and colorful and abundant tail, which is supposedly a signal of fitness, and in general it is, because you have to invest a lot of resources in growth and in development to produce a big tail like that. You have to be healthy to make it bright and so on. But it would be possible to cheat, and what Dawkins suggested was one of the ways that you could fool selfish genes is that since genes, you don't really have a way of knowing who's related to you for sure. especially beyond mother-child relationship. Parenthood is uncertain for males. It's unclear for siblings whether they're really whether they're full siblings or half siblings, uh, and so on. So Dawkins said, why wouldn't there be a green dot, for example? Why couldn't a gene code for both, um, for a green dot on the forehead, and then everybody that has that gene gets the green dot, and then you can be helpful and altruistic only towards creatures that have that green dot. The trouble is that a green dot can be invaded by cheaters. You can have cheater genes that are not relatives of yours. In fact, they're very unfit, and all they do is produce the green dot, and then they get the advantage of having all the ones that actually have the fit gene to help them survive and reproduce to their own at their own disadvantage. It means that the cheater survives and reproduces, and the fit ones have wasted their energy and they don't. That is an evolutionarily unstable strategy. What would happen if there were such a cheater gene, a cheater trait, would be that at first it would get an advantage, and then the ones that it was gaining the advantage from would be phased out by the fact that they were losing to the cheater gene. The cheater gene would increase in numbers, they would decrease in numbers, and then the advantage to the cheater gene would start vanishing, and it would diminish in numbers, and the right ones would keep coming back. And this is evolutionarily unstable. It doesn't produce a good a solution. It just keeps oscillating between unstable possibilities. And so a cheater gene is not a good solution. What about cheaters for peacock tails? Why can't you have, for example, peacocks that produce a big, beautiful tail and are otherwise totally unfit? Well, there are other ways of controlling for cheaters, and the Zahavi effect is that if you have a huge tail like this, then it's pretty for females and it attracts females, but it's also very hard to escape from predators when you have such a huge tail trailing behind you, and therefore probably the tail does indicate fitness, because if you can survive with such a huge tail, then you must be pretty fit. That's the Zahavi sort of control hypothesis for how it is that you can control for cheating in indicators of fitness. This is not an indicator of genetic relatedness, it's an indicator of fitness, but this is also a protector against cheating. I think for indicators of relatedness, nobody's proposed a way to protect against that. The only thing that protects against it is what I mentioned before, which is situation, namely the siblings that you're raised with are much more likely to be your own siblings than strangers are. And parents, for parents especially, for females, it's very likely that the offspring that you give birth to were not artificially implanted in you, but they're really yours. And for the male, let's say if he sticks around the female enough and is vigilant enough, then he can be fairly sure that it's his genes as well. One of the big distinctions that people make in evolutionary psychology is between the original environment, the one in which traits originally arose, and the current environment. The famous example is sugar. Children have a sweet tooth, and they probably have a sweet tooth because in the original environment sugar was rare and predators were common, and we all know that sugar gives you a quick energy, and children needed to be able to escape from predators, and therefore when sugar is rare, it's important to have a sweet tooth, which makes you eat as much of it as you can get when there's a bit of it available. The uh, Paleolithic, or even earlier than that, our ancestors, when sugar was rare, those children that were indifferent to sugar were probably the children that never managed to survive and reproduce, because when they needed energy, they didn't have it. But today we have a candy machine on every corner, and the only effect of our sweet tooth in children is to produce a lot of tooth decay and diabetes and heart problems. So a trait that used to be adaptive in the original environment is not necessarily adaptive in the current environment. Of course, the sweet tooth is not sufficiently maladaptive yet to have killed off the kids that have a sweet tooth. So it's simply a handicap. It probably diminishes reproductive success. I mean, who wants to mate with somebody with a rotten, smelly mouth from having eaten a lot of sugar? But it's not enough of a handicap to have priced itself out of the market yet. The distinction is important, though, because it's naive. It's just as bad as anthropomorphism to try to speculate about the origins of a trait based on the contemporary environment. You have to go back to the original environment to try to figure out if it is in fact a genetic trait, and often it isn't. But if it is a genetic trait, its origins have to be traced to the original environment and not the current environment. Related to that distinction is also the distinction between the distal and the proximal cause. This time I'll also use appetite for food, but this time I won't talk particularly about sugar and the sweet tooth, but simply the feeling that we get when we're hungry, that we want to eat. That's caused by low blood sugar, and the reason we have a tendency to want to eat when we feel hungry, and in fact, even the reason we feel hungry when our blood sugar is low, is because the distal cause is that we need to have our blood sugar raised. That's the signal that our blood sugar is low and we need to get some food in there. But the proximal cause is that food tastes good, and when you're hungry, you feel like eating. So you mustn't mix up the purpose of eating, which is to raise blood sugar. That's the distal purpose, with the proximal purpose, the thing that the evolutionary psychologists like to call the psychological mechanism, which is I eat because it tastes good, and I eat because I'm hungry, and I feel like eating. The link between the two is that the distal cause in the original environment was what made you feel like eating when you were hungry, and that gave you a sweet tooth, and that gave you a preference for mates in your own species rather than trees, and so on and so forth. So the proximal stimulus is the psychological stimulus, if you like, and the distal stimulus is the evolutionary cause of the appealingness or the repulsiveness in some cases of the proximal stimulus. The fear of spiders also is because of our original environment. Today we're not much under a threat of spiders, but in the original environment presumably we were, and we were under threat from snakes, and so we have this special reaction to snakes and spiders. The big question is whether these obvious examples, mating preferences, snakes, spiders, etc., are these a big part of our everyday cognitive lives? Because after all, the evolutionary psychology papers say they're going to give us psychological mechanisms, and they're going to be special psychological mechanisms for every one of the original environment situations that they were adaptive for. But is that true? You should, in the same way that I sometimes ask you to look at a dictionary to find out how many words are likely to be the names of categories that were innate, you should now look at your everyday lives and see how many of the things that you can do that are useful to you in your present life are likely to be homologues of some challenge that you faced, some specific challenge that you faced in the original environment. Notice that evolutionary psychologists don't like general mechanisms of learning, because general mechanisms of learning would, of course, they too would be evolved, but they'd be general. They wouldn't be specific to a situation. And so a lot of the things that a lot of the category learning that we do, and the linguistic learning that we do, is very general. It's not like a bunch of spider phobias. It's that the same mechanism works for a lot of different categories and a lot of different situations and a lot of different problems. You should ask yourself, when you're evaluating sort of the scope of evolutionary psychology, it's undeniable that we evolved and that evolution had to play a huge role in shaping us into what we are. But the question is, how many of the specific kinds of sex and phobia related mechanisms that the evolutionary psychologists go on and on about, how much of those generalizes to our everyday cognitive life today? In general, what I'm saying is that there seems to be a dividing line, which is very difficult to find, between things that are obviously evolutionary adaptations, like the spider phobia and the snake phobia and the preference for the opposite sex, and perhaps certain aspects of male-female sexual jealousy and so on. Those things are clearly evolutionary, but the question is, what about situations where it's clearly ridiculous? And I'll close with a ridiculous example. One of the many theories of the origin of language was a theory that was related to the peacock hypothesis, except that instead of the peacock's tail and then the handicap of having to get away from predators with such a huge tail as being sort of the control for cheating, this hypothesis says that the origin of language was that it, like the peacock's tail, it's a sexual display. Females like males that are smooth talkers, so males became smooth talkers. But the control against cheating was that in order to be able to be a smooth talker, you have to have a big brain which is intelligent. And that really is a sign of fitness. And so females are right to go for the smooth talkers rather than for the mute brutes. Well, I'll leave that to you to contemplate. To me, that's on the ridiculous side of evolutionary psychology, along with theories that all men are rapists and you need a rape inhibition mechanism and stuff like that. I think that's overstating it vastly. And the real trick is to find where the genuine formative role of evolution makes sense and where it doesn't make sense. Our next session will be on the evolution of language.